Good morning. Welcome to week 11 of Simple. This is the week we talk about attachment theory. What does this image represent?
Okay. Um, so, today it's going to be mostly me and Kate. But, so far what um, we've been doing is we're trying to understand ourselves, right? And one of the models that we presented is the one on the left there, which is despite what we sometimes believe, our rational mind is kind of the tip of the iceberg. It's not what's really in control. It's not what determines how we behave and how we think. And um, it's more what determines it is what's under the surface that we can't see. That's why it's so difficult to change. And one of the things that we've started to kind of explore that's under the surface um, is instincts, right? Because instincts underlie emotions. So instincts are the hardware of emotions, right? So we've talked about, 5 different instincts, talked about the seeking and avoidance, talked about reproduction, talked about the attachment, talked about fight and flight. Fight and flight comes before attachment. Fight or flight, attachment, and then play, right? Um, and those are important to know because those are if we have emotions that are dysregulated, um, it's often because something has affected our instincts. Okay, something has impacted our instincts. And the two big instincts that really dysregulate our emotions are attachment, which we're going to start talking about today, and then fight or flight. Okay, so attachment is affected by what happens to you early in life, the first types of relationships that you have, okay? Because those set the mold for later relationships. So the type of relationship that you have early in life, that's what you think this is going to be. All my relationships are going to be like that. You adapted to that. And that's why people keep having the same kind of relationship throughout their life. We're going to look at that in detail today. So, it's important for us to know that, the type of relationship we have early in life with our caregivers is very influential of the later relationships we're going to have. And if we have trouble in later relationships, it's often because we've had trouble in earlier relationships. Okay. And we need to pay attention to that. So, so that's, just a little bit of a review of what we've done so far. So we fall into holes because of our dysregulated emotions. Now today, and you've seen the picture on the left. What you haven't seen is the picture on the right there. And that's the metaphor that we're going to introduce today. Because a really good metaphor for attachment is a boat and a harbor. Okay. So what happens is that, you know, human beings like babies and stuff, the thing is they want to explore. They have curiosity. They want to play. They want to go out there. Okay. And it's a little affected by their temperament, but generally kids want to go explore. And that's fine, so long as they feel safe. What happens is that if there's some threat, some thing that signals danger to them, what they need to do, because they can't protect themselves, they're little kids, right? They run back to the harbor. Okay, so we're like ships that if the sea is calm and everything is going well, there's no storms, there's no pirates out there, whatever, right? We can go and happily sail the sea, right? But if there's like a danger, we want to run back to the harbor, which protects us. That's a really good metaphor for attachment. We're going to talk a lot more about that today, about that metaphor. And what you're going to see is that not all harbors are the same. Okay. We're going to talk about how some harbors are really welcoming. They're wide. the boat feels comfortable going into that harbor. Other harbors are hard to get into. Other harbors are impossible to get into, all right? And other harbors are dangerous, okay? So that's a really good metaphor for attachment that we're going to explore today.
We're here at week 11. We have next week, and then we're off for 2 weeks, December 24th and 31st. And then again in March on the March 11th and 18th. Let's do our meditation. Feel free to skip it if you find meditation triggering. Let's look at our dashboards, our personal dashboards. What is the current risk that I'll experience a state of crisis? Am I in the window of tolerance? Where is my energy tank right now? Have I been tracking my targets using the Holes diary card? How would I rate my targets right now? How well am I focusing on what I'm doing? This is the Safe Harbor meditation. Begin by settling into a comfortable position. Let your body soften and take a slow, steady breath in and a long, gentle breath out. Allow your eyes to close or soften. Imagine now that you are a small ship on a wide ocean. The water stretches all the way to the horizon, calm and glistening in the light. Feel the gentle rise and fall beneath you, the rocking that reminds you that you are held by something larger than yourself. Notice the sky above, open, spacious, and patient. This ocean is the landscape of your life, your feelings, your needs, your hopes. Allow yourself to float here for a moment, simply breathing with the sea. Now, imagine that the weather around you begins to shift, not in a frightening way, just the natural changes of life. A breeze becomes a wind. Clouds gather. Waves lift gently, then a bit more. These changing conditions represent the way you feel stress, loneliness, anxiety, uncertainty, or simply the need for comfort. Notice that every ship, no matter how sturdy, encounters weather like this. You're not doing anything wrong. Storms are part of being human. As the waves rise around you, look ahead and see a harbor. It's a place of refuge, a place where you can turn inward, rest, and feel held. This harbor represents safety, the safety that others once gave you, and the safety you can learn to give yourself. Imagine guiding your ship gently toward this harbor. The closer you come, the calmer the water becomes. Lights appear along the entrance, soft and steady, like someone saying, "Welcome home, I'm here." Let your ship glide into this safe space. Feel the quiet. Feel the anchoring. Feel the exhale that comes when you know you can rest. Now imagine dropping your anchor. Hear the quiet sound of it touching the harbor floor. Your ship becomes steady, still, supported. Bring your attention to your body. Where do you feel this anchoring? Maybe in your chest, your belly, your shoulders. Wherever you notice it, breathe into that place. Allow yourself to feel what secure attachment feels like in this moment. I am allowed to seek safety. I am allowed to rest. I am worthy of protection and care. Let these words settle inside you like warm light. Now, gently imagine that the harbor you're resting in isn't just out there in the world. It's also inside you. You carry a harbor within your own heart, a place where you can welcome yourself, comfort yourself, and hold your own storms with gentleness. Take one last slow breath in, and as you breathe out, feel that inner harbor become a little stronger, a little more familiar, a little more your own. And when you're ready, softly open your eyes. Bring this sense of steadiness with you into the rest of your day. So this is our practice session schedule. We still need a volunteer for the IFS practice May 6th. If you're interested, please send us an email. This is the homework from last week. And this is the homework for this coming week. Submit your questions or comments to the email address. Read the skills training workbook, the green workbook, pages 110 to 131. Read the simple manual session 15, that's the gray manual. Do at least 2 advanced chain analysis in the next week. That's what we touched on last week. Continue reviewing and practicing your crisis plans and doing your HOLES diary cards. Continue tracking all the skills you've learned using your skills list. And review the homework habits checklist each week. You don't have to go to the homework group to do that. You can do it independently. If there's an item you haven't checked on the list, consider setting a goal to do that. This is the DBT Advanced Mindfulness skills that we'll be covering. Wise mind, how to make wise mind decisions, radical acceptance, judgments and labels, self-compassion, and mindful communication. Here's a copy of the homework habits checklist. And just a reminder to keep comments, questions, and feedback brief so that everyone has a chance to participate. The announcements for this week, we're having our holiday get-together December 22nd from 12:30 to 2:30 in the boardroom at the Stratford Family Health Team on Duro Street. There'll be pizza and drinks and a gift exchange. Crafts, poems, and regifts are encouraged. Email us at itsimple2023@gmail.com if you're interested in attending. If you're doing the course on Zoom and like to join in person, there's lots of room. This is our list of who has RSVP'd, and please send us an email if you'd like to be added to the list.
I'm also just sharing quickly, I'm going to be sending an email to the people whose names were just listed there, probably by the end of the day today, just to organize that gift exchange. If you didn't see your name there and you're on Zoom and want to send me a quick message because you think you signed up, that would be great. Sorry to interject there. Thanks.
Here's the list if you want to take a closer look. This is who's RSVP'd. Okay. This is the summary from last week. Joan and Nicole went through some basic mindfulness skills, and we learned about advanced chain analysis, which is like regular chain analysis, except you're considering all of the phases of your activation And for each phase, you're recording the feelings, thoughts, bodily sensations, and behaviors that went along with the activation. We had some emailed questions, comments, and feedback. Okay. So we're going to do a show of hands to see if people would like to go through the response for this question. I'm still living in an abusive relationship. Is this course going to help me heal? Is this the
I
one
think
we're
we want to
going?
do this
Yeah.
one, yeah.
I can't see. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to X out of these. Okay. Yes. Yes, this work may be even more important for those who are still living within difficult or abusive environments, but the kind of healing possible must be understood realistically.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are two kinds of healing, safety-based and self-based. In a perfect world, all trauma therapy would take place in environments that are physically and emotionally safe. But many people trying to heal cannot change their environment because of finances, disability, or unavoidable family obligations. So we have to distinguish two types of healing. A, safety-based healing happens when the environment is stable and non-abusive. People can rebuild trust, experiment with vulnerability, and reorganize their nervous system with fewer external threats. B, self-based healing occurs when the environment is imperfect or still triggering. Here, the focus is on regulating the nervous system in the moment, protecting vulnerable parts, building internal boundaries, not internalizing the behavior of others, and staying in wise mind even when others are dysregulated. Self-based healing is possible even when the environment is still hard. It often becomes a form of inner emancipation long before the person can create outer emancipation. It's natural to fear that if the abuse is still continuing, you cannot heal, but trauma is not only what happens to you, it's also what happens inside you now in response. Even if the original abuser is still present, or even if the patterns replay in new relationships, you can still heal your relationship to yourself. The most important shift is from automatic activation to curiosity about the activation, and from absorbing the other person's behavior to recognizing whose energy belongs to whom. This means that while your external behavior might not change right away, your internal world can change dramatically. When that happens, you no longer absorb blame or shame. You see the abuser's behavior as a result of their psychological issues rather than a verdict about your worth. You can then assert healthy boundaries without turning them against yourself, and you may eventually feel empowered to change your situation when feasible. This is not full healing, but it's the beginning of healing and sometimes the most crucial part. Erickson teaches us that humans develop through 8 stages. Trauma interrupts these stages, but they can be revisited later in life. Even in an abusive household, a person can practice autonomy, build identity separate from the family, experience small acts of initiative, cultivate industry, competence, pleasure, and mastery, access intimacy or trust through friendships, partners, or group spaces, and experience generativity by caring for their own selves. You can be actively rerunning the missing developmental stages within your own nervous system, even if your environment is not ideal. This is profound developmental repair. That your old patterns repeat themselves in new relationships doesn't mean that nothing is changing. Repetition with partners or other figures is extremely common, but the meaning shifts as healing progresses. At first, the repetition is unconscious and you automatically activate. Later, You'll become more aware of the patterns and make them targets for change. You begin to notice the patterns earlier, soothe yourself better, communicate more clearly, choose different responses, refuse harmful dynamics, and eventually choose different partners or patterns entirely. In other words, the pattern may still happen, but your relationship to the pattern transforms. When the abuse continues as you're trying to heal, the course can help regulate your nervous system, reduce self-blame and shame, build internal boundaries, reduce automatic reactivity, create strategic distance internally, even when physical distance isn't yet possible, give hope, clarity, orientation, and agency, and lay the groundwork for eventual change. You cannot force a mother or partner to change. You may not be able to escape an actively dangerous environment or fully heal trauma that is still being inflicted daily. You can, however, stay safer internally and prepare yourself to make clearer, safer, more empowered decisions externally. This is very significant healing work. So the next question, I haven't had any contact with my family for 3 years. I'm torn about it, but I feel like I need to protect myself from them. I recently heard about family estrangement. Can you tell us more about it? And this is a great question, but we're going to come back to it at the end of the session.
I'll do that.
Okay.
Oh, thanks, Kate.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, so somebody asked me last week about, if healing can still occur, even if you're still in a difficult, abusive situation. And so that's a really important question because it applies to a lot of people. I see a lot of people that are like that. And that's the answer. And I'd encourage you to go to the website and read that a little bit with more time because it's important. Okay. And then there was another email that I got, which I was curious about. And we're doing the homework for this course is really important. I think you can get a lot of from the course without doing the homework, but doing the homework is like the practice. It's where the rubber meets the road. So we're really kind of trying to do everything possible to encourage people to do the homework. And this year is the first time we're having like a homework group. Um, but this morning I got an email that there's people who have just on their own kind of found the homework buddy and they're doing it with a homework buddy. They're meeting. So Michelle and Jackie, if you don't mind my sharing that, you've formed a little duo where you do the homework together. And from the email that I got from Michelle, you were saying this is really helpful because you're going through it, helping each other to understand. I was just wondering if, like, just very, very briefly, do you, either Jackie or Michelle, do you have any comments about that?
Is Jackie online, Dr. Cleto?
I don't know. I can't see.
Yep,
But you
I'm
go
here.
ahead.
Okay,
Sorry.
Jackie, you do it. You talk less than I do.
What? You want me to do it?
Yeah.
Is it helping, Jackie?
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
I would say that I'm having problems with procrastinating and leaving stuff to the last minute. So Michelle and I were taking turns doing the reading yesterday. So that helped. And then we talked to each other about any clarification we needed on what we read. I feel like it was beneficial to me talking with her. And it also takes a bit of the load off, and you have somebody to bounce back your thoughts, feelings, behaviors, sensations. We went through all that stuff. But yeah, that's what I have to say about it.
So, even though we have the homework group, if you want to work with somebody here, you can approach them and, do like an informal little homework buddy system. If you're interested and you want us to help you to kind of set things up, you can email us as well. Now, I thought that if you're doing this on your own, what I kind of like thought might happen. I'm sure it won't, but I don't want people to feel that, oh, this is not really addressing my needs, but I don't want to be rude and not work with this person. So the couple of slides there are suggestions. If you do form a homework group or buddy, if you have a homework buddy, take a look at those suggestions because it's important. If it's not working for you, don't continue doing it just to be polite or because you're afraid of hurting the person. So I won't go through it, but come back to the slides and it's kind of like a checklist looking at whether this is working for you that you might do every week if you have a homework buddy. And then if it's not working, there's also some suggestions of how to speak with the other person about it. Okay.
Dr. Cleto, I just wanted to mention that you have to follow the algorithms very closely, like you mentioned to me on Monday again when I was working with Danko. You can't sway off of, it's not there, like Jackie and I are not there to like talk about problems. We're there to follow the algorithms. We have the sheets there. We're doing the readings. We're not talking or complaining. Like if we have an issue, then we break it down on one of the algorithms. Like you can't burden the other person. It's just strictly that you're working on the homework. It's not for emotional support. It's for getting through the homework.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So that's very important. So that's good. I think good learning. Thank you, Michelle. Okay. So this is we already covered a little bit of this in the introduction at the beginning when I had the pictures up, but just a little bit of a review and a preview. So far we've talked about the evolution of the emotional, rational, and wise minds. That was like way back at the beginning. And we talked about personality classifications, theories, and theories of development of personality. Then we talked about temperament. We talked about character, things like parenting styles, authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, uninvolved, and how they affect personality development. And today, we're going to talk about attachment theory and how attachment plays a critical role in shaping personality, right? And I said that at the beginning. And sorry. Oh, Weight Watchers. Okay. No. Okay. Sorry about that. Somebody walked into the room and they were at the wrong meeting. But yeah, so what I said at the beginning is that those early patterns that are established with your caregivers at the beginning tend to be repeated. You're going to have the same kind of relationships. So attachment affects your relationships, and relationships are so important to our well-being. So attachment is really important. So remember that attachment is an instinct. I already said this. It's part of our biological hardware. Like any instinct, it gets shaped by the environment that we grow up in. Today, we're going to look at how this built-in attachment system, the instinct, is shaped by our earliest relationships and how those early experiences influence the patterns of how we relate to others that we carry into adulthood. So if you have adult dysfunctional relationships, very often it's because you're repeating patterns from childhood. Not always, but often. Okay, so let's look a little bit at the origins of attachment theory. Where did it come from? Okay, so I think in the early 20th century, and I kind of grew up in the middle of the 20th century. I was born in 1960, but in Portugal, I think these beliefs were still very prevalent, right? And I think in North America as well, right? And it's not until the last 20 or 30 years that our thinking has changed. But in the early 20th century, the idea that infants only needed physical nourishment. That's all they needed. Food, hygiene, warmth, okay? To grow into healthy adults dominated psychology and medicine. That's what people thought. That's what the experts thought. They only need physical. They only need physical, things to grow up. So paying attention to, let me try to get rid of this here. So paying attention to children's emotional and psychological needs was thought to be unimportant. Okay, I'm going to read that again. Paying attention to children's emotional and psychological needs was thought to be unimportant or even damaging. Okay, this belief was rooted in several interwoven historical, cultural, and scientific currents. So one of the currents, it was a scientific current, was this psychological theory, which was called behavioralism. And behavioralism, some of the proponents were John Watson, B.F. Skinner, and they dominated psychology in the early 20th century. So behaviorists emphasized that observable behavior and downplayed inner emotional or unconscious processes. So in those days, like psychology was all about just the behavior. They wanted to be very scientific. And they said, let's forget about emotion. So they didn't pay any attention to this, right? To what was going on in people's inner experience. John Watson argued that expressing affection to children, John Watson argued against expressing affection to children, okay? And this was like the poobah in psychology in those days, fearing that it would create dependency and weakness. In his book, Psychological Care of Infant and Child, written in 1928, he famously advised parents to avoid hugging and kissing their children too much. Infants, in his view, were shaped primarily by reinforcement, rewards, and punishment, not by emotional bonds. Now, but this idea kind of antedated Watson. So even Sigmund Freud, initially Sigmund Freud did talk about the importance of early childhood in the formation of personality, but later on, and Freud, the beginning, he thought trauma was really important in development of personality, okay? But he abandoned that theory, and there were several reasons why he abandoned it. One reason was that as he was talking to his patients came to him, and they were all kind of emotionally struggling, right? But one after another started talking about abuse in childhood, especially sexual abuse, but other kinds of abuse as well, right? And Freud lived in Vienna, and it was a close Jewish community, and you knew the parents of these people that were coming to him, right? And he thought, no, they're like upstanding citizens. It can't be. But the other thing was that actually, because people were coming to him in those days, they were struggling with they called it in the day, and today it's kind of a bit of a derogatory term, but they called it hysteria. Okay, today it's kind of don't mention that word, but in those days it was what the diagnosis was, and actually Freud's sister suffered a lot of those symptoms, and Freud couldn't believe that. Well, my sister has this, and it can't be. My father can't have abused. He can't have been abused in our family. So he cast aside the theory that trauma and early childhood influences are determining of personality. And he said, no, let's focus on what's going on, the fantasies of a child. And that's, the Oedipal theory, the idea that boys want to sleep with their mothers. I think that was like incredibly, Freud is a great pioneer and he had a lot of great contributions. This was like a wrong turn that he took. Right? But it set psychology and psychiatry back, because psychology and psychiatry, rather than focusing on what was happening to people, is focusing on their fantasies, what was going on inside, right? And became the theories that they had became more and more convoluted and more difficult to understand. I was exposed a little bit to that because where I went to school in McGill was still one of the last bastions of psychoanalytical or psychodynamic psychotherapy. And it's like, what? Right? And then there was this other approach, which is object relations. It's also part of psychodynamic theory, but object relations says, no, it's about what happens to you. Okay. And attachment theory is very much in the spirit of object relations. It's what happens to you that's important, not like, dipple fantasies and, all the stuff that happens inside. Okay, so Sigmund Freud emphasized the importance of early childhood in the formation of personality, but focused more on the child's internal drives, like libido or aggression, than on the relational needs of infancy, of infants. While Freud acknowledged mother-infant relationships, he believed that for the most part, infants loved their mother because she satisfied their hunger. Okay, very much what Watson was saying. They loved their mother because she satisfied their hunger. Okay. In the late 19th and 20th century, many infants in orphanages and hospitals were cared for physically, but received little emotional or physical affection. Okay? And what you saw was that there's this thing called failure to thrive. There was like a lot of illness, and there's a lot of very high mortality in these, hold on a second, in these institutions. Okay? And people didn't link that with emotional neglect. They thought, this is because of infections, because of other causes. So the high mortality rates in these institutions were attributed to disease and hygiene, not to emotional neglect. Infants were often kept in clean but sterile environments and separated from caregivers to avoid infection, a practice that further deprived them of human contact. So this is like the idea that it's only the physical needs. And it's, if you keep them clean, if you feed them well, they're going to thrive. And it's like, that's so wrong, right? Because we don't just physical needs, we have emotional needs. And if those aren't met, we wither and, we die. So in the Victorian and early 20th century Western societies, emotional restraint and early independence were considered virtues. Excessive mothering was feared to produce weak, overly dependent children. Love was often seen as a harmful indulgence. Okay. Before the mid-20th century, there was little scientific study of emotional development of infants or the consequences of maternal deprivation. Without evidence to the contrary, physical care was considered sufficient. Okay. So if you're a little bit older, this was probably how you grew up. It's like, not going to neglect kids' emotional needs, right? As long as they're fed and, that's enough. Okay. But then there was a change. And this guy, John Bowlby, was at the center of that change. Right? And he was also the father of attachment theory. So John Bowlby was born in 1907 into an upper middle class British family. His father was Sir Anthony Alfred Bowlby. He was a baronet, and he was a surgeon to King Edward VII. So Sir Anthony, so Bowlby's father, had lost his own father when he was 5 years old. Okay, so I kind of wonder how that affected him. Because of his work as a surgeon to the king, Sir Anthony lived in court, not at home, but he lived in court. Sorry? Oh, okay. That better?
Yeah.
Right. All right. Okay. So because of his work, Bowlby's father lived in court most of the year, and the couple, so Bowlby's father and mother, spent very little time with their children. Children in those days in upper middle class British families were often raised by nannies. Okay. When Bowlby was 4 years old, so he attached to this nanny who had been there from the time he was born. But when he was 4 years old, this nanny, who was like emotionally was his mother, left the family. Okay. And that for Bowlby, because he never saw his parents, right? He thought this nanny was his mother, but that was as good as losing your mother, her dying. She left the family. Okay. Um, just all right. So later, he described this event as a traumatic loss. Then, to add injury to insult, or to add insult to injury, at age 7, which was also the practice if you're upper middle class British, Bowlby was sent to a boarding school. And he saw this as a great source of emotional suffering. Okay? So not only did he lose, his parents weren't there, he lost his nanny, right? And then he was sent to boarding school, which was very strict and very abusive, right? Um, and so you can kind of see that Bowlby himself must have had a lot of attachment issues, right? He might have attached to the nanny, but he would write that I wouldn't send a dog to boarding school, right? Anybody see The Crown? Yeah, that series, right? So they depicted a little bit what they went through in boarding school. Okay. So in 1922, he was only 15 years old. Can you imagine? He went to medical school when he was 15 years old. Um, and then later, he underwent psychoanalytical training, completing it in 1937. So that was a traditional training those days, didn't have a lot of medications. So if you were a psychiatrist, you did psychoanalytical training, which is like in the spirit of Freud. But what he met is he met all these teachings that was all about the child's fantasy. And Bowlby was very concerned about what was actually happening to children, not what, these fantasies that these analysts were elaborating, which were like very hard to understand. So he didn't kind of really wasn't popular with his supervising analyst. He was thought to be like a bit of a troubled guy. So he wasn't a good fit for this kind of approach. In 1936, he began working at the London Child Guidance Clinic, where, from among his patients, he studied a series of 44 they were called juvenile delinquents. That's the title of his paper when he did it. So 1940, published a paper entitled 44 Juvenile Delinquents, Their Character and Home Life. So he was starting to look at what happened to these kids. And that day, looking at trying to link the delinquency with what happened to them, like the trauma that happened to them, was unheard of, right? When this paper was published, people were going, they were shocked, right? They're going, this guy is off his rocker, right? He postulated that there was a connection between early parental deprivation and a criminal character. Okay? So the idea that there might be a connection between childhood conditions and delinquency was, in Bowlby's time, widely rejected. Okay? It was more thought that, people are just born this way. It's not, that what happens to them makes them this way. They were born this way. So in 1946, Bowlby went to work at London's Tavistock Clinic, which is one of the most famous clinics, psychiatric clinics in the world. And Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, was working there. And another super famous analyst, Melanie Klein, was also working there. They couldn't stand each other. Anna Freud and Melanie Klein, they're always kind of, trying to updo one another and stuff. And so Bowlby became director of that clinic, and he was caught in the middle of, these two warring figures. All right. So Bowlby transformed his own pain, because obviously he was struggling with issues, right? Into a framework that helped the world better understand the needs of children. Right? I mean, what you see nowadays is that you see a lot of people that have pain, but rather than contributing to the world, they make it worse. They make the world worse. They take it out on others. Hurt people, right? But hurt people can also transform their pain in a positive way, right? Which is what Bowlby did. So Bowlby had a number of influences. He didn't come up with this theory just on his own. There are people around him that were thinking about the same things. And one a big influence on him was this guy, Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz was an ethologist, so he studied animals and birds and their behavior. And he's famous for this thing called imprinting, right? And particularly he was working with ducks or geese. And what he discovered was that in geese, there's a rapid early life learning process in which goslings form a strong attachment to the first moving object they see, often their mother. So normal circumstances, their mother. So and that's like, okay, I'm going to follow this mother, right? That's called imprinting. But if the first thing they see is not their mother, but it's something else, they'll imprint to that other thing, right? And they'll follow this thing. And so how Lorenz and his students were working is that they had different boots, like those rubber boots, and they would have different patterns. Like some of them had pink polka dots, others had yellow polka dots. They had different patterns, and the ducklings, the geese, that's the first they saw the boots. And that became their mother. They imprinted to that. And then they just followed those boots. They wouldn't follow boots with any other pattern. They'd follow boots with that particular pattern. So that was imprinting. Okay. So Bowlby's attachment theory was inspired by the work of Konrad Lorenz. Bowlby was familiar with Lorenz's work. And he began to think that maybe a similar process was occurring in human infants as well. There's an imprinting, right? There was another psychoanalyst, Rene Spitz, and Rene Spitz was working with institutionalized infants, and he was documenting the severe emotional and developmental disturbances he saw in babies deprived of maternal care, even if they received adequate physical care. So Spitz was one of the pioneers in that. Remember, in those days, they didn't think that kids had emotional needs. It was just physical needs. So he was going against the current, right? But Bowlby was very influenced by these two figures. And he was also influenced by Harry Harlow, who was also working around that time. And Harlow is famous for his rhesus monkeys. He did a lot of experiments with rhesus monkeys. He was trying to study learning, and he had to breed monkeys. He wasn't originally intending to do this work, but because he had to breed monkeys, what he realized is that how the monkeys were raised affected their personality, whether they seemed emotionally well or whether they seemed really anxious. So he kind of abandoned his original research, which was on memory, and he pursued this for the rest of his life, okay? Studying how rearing conditions, how these rhesus monkeys were raised, affected their development, their personality, right? So Bowlby knew about about Harlow, and that was another big influence. Harlow demonstrated, among other things, that infant monkeys prefer soft, comforting surrogate mothers. They obviously prefer like a real mother, right? But if they didn't have that, they would go for like the soft, comforting cloth mother over wire ones that had like a bottle that fed them. They would kind of like go to the wire one and feed from that, but go back to the mother that was the cloth mother. Okay. And I don't know, I think last year, what happened there? Oh, okay. I had a little bit more about Harlow last year, but I don't think I included this year. The other influence on Bowlby was Harry Edelstone, a British psychiatrist, who was very concerned about the effects of hospitalization on children. So you see these converging lines. So common practice at that time, inspired by the idea that, kids only have physical needs, right? Was that parents were not allowed contact with their kids during hospitalizations. This was thought important in preventing the transmission of infections and maintaining order, because parents came in, kids got upset, right? And parents might bring in, diseases, germs, and stuff like that. So let's keep them out, right? And kids actually, if you kept the parents out, they became very subdued. They were really good, right? After a little while. initially they protest a lot, but after a while they seem to be really good. So Edelstone thought this practice of not allowing parents to visit significantly harmed children's mental health, especially if hospitalizations were prolonged and involved painful procedures. So, danger, right? The medical community rejected this idea, Edelstone's idea, that, they resisted for a long time, right? That parents should be allowed to visit. They focused on children's physical needs and were oblivious to their emotional ones. Incensed at this state of affairs, Bowlby hired James Robertson, a social worker who was passionate about changing the traditional children's hospitalization practices. He wanted to end that practice of not allowing parents to visit. So in 1952, Bowlby and Robertson made a film called A Two-Year-Old Goes to Hospital, which finally got the message through and led reforms to the system, eventually allowing parents unlimited access to hospitalized children. So they filmed this little girl. I have a little excerpt from that movie. I'll show you in a second. And what they did is that Robertson went on a tour. He took the movie and, it was edited, and it was like, the little girl when she came in with the parents, and then like a little bit later, and it kind of documented the changes that you saw in her, right? And when he presented that to people all over the world, it became undeniable that, there's something deeply affecting this child, right? And so this was really like a watershed in the recognition that children have emotional needs and that you can't isolate them from their parents. So among his many books and articles, Bowlby wrote a trilogy that cemented its legacy. It's called Attachment and Loss, Volume 1, Attachment, Volume 2, Separation, and Volume 3, Loss, Sadness, and Depression, in which he describes his theory. Okay, so that's, let me show you a little bit of the movie. This is only like a couple of minutes, and it's a longer movie, but, can't show you the whole thing.
Gemini and Gmail can help you summarize long threads and suggest brilliant replies faster than it took me to sit for this.
Seeing this little girl sitting by herself, quietly clutching her teddy and her baby, it is easy to believe that she has settled in. She does not cry or demand attention. But see what happens when the nurse comes at playtime. Today it takes longer to make contact, and although the nurse tries hard to cheer her up with toys, Laura doesn't respond. Soon her feelings appear. No, don't. She asked, "Why is that boy crying?" and immediately burst into tears. Again she says, "I want my mummy."
So, okay. What, it was hard. They didn't have empathy in those days, right? They thought, for an adult, if you go to hospital, you know that you're not being separated from, your family because you can hold that in your mind, right? But what was happening to this kid is she was grieving, right? For her, because she's 2 years old, she can't understand what's going on. So it's as good as losing her mother. All right. And the thing is, we're going to talk about trauma, right? That doesn't go away. That stays with you, right? And it has long-lasting damaging effects unless you're able to process it. Okay. So let me just amplify that there. Okay. So Bowlby realized that the commonality between the 44 juvenile delinquents he studied and the children that had been harmed by hospitalizations, such as the one we just saw, right, was that they had both endured a significant period of maternal deprivation and grieving, right? At the time, mothers were primary caregivers. Today, we call it parental deprivation, to acknowledge that fathers can be the primary caregivers, right? Today, we call this parental deprivation or neglect. So Bowlby, drawing on his own personal experience, his nanny left when he was 4 years old. Parents were not around, okay? Realized that parents and children formed a lasting psychological connection, and he named this attachment. That wasn't a thing before Bowlby, right? Attachment was not a thing. I mean, it was obviously a thing. It's an instinct, but it wasn't something that we had identified and studied, right? So Bowlby came to believe that attachment served the evolutionary purpose of keeping the infant close to the mother, thus improving the child's chances of survival. We'll come back to this a little bit later on. I'll expand on this a little bit. He also believed that the earliest bonds formed by children with their caregivers have a tremendous impact on personality and well-being that lasts throughout an individual's life. Okay. So it's interesting because now when I see people, I would say like 95% of people that I see, what I put in my formulation is that they have an attachment disorder. I don't remember seeing anybody who's come to see me for an assessment recently who doesn't have an attachment disorder. Okay. Because secure attachment, which is not having an attachment disorder is insecure forms of attachment, is just so protective of mental health. That doesn't mean you can't have mental health issues. If you have secure attachment, you can. It's much less common, right? All right. So Bowlby defined the attachment instinct as the capacity for connection with others that is present at birth in every normal human baby, and that is shaped by early experiences with caregivers. He argued that attachment styles established by age 2 determine how individuals relate to others and to the world for the remainder of their lives. Yeah, it's so interesting. I was seeing a gentleman yesterday that I've known for many years, right? And he's in his 80s now, right? So he grew up, emotional needs weren't thought about, right? So he grew up like free range, but he was also gay. So he had to, that was, if you reveal that, you were rejected. So he learned to not trust he couldn't trust anybody because he didn't have secure attachment, and he kept everything to himself. Right? And all his life, he's repeated that pattern. So he so much desires intimacy or connection to people, but is incapable of it. Right? He's very good at doing things for others. Right? So he's great. He helps people and gives people things, but he can't feel anything back. Right? So we're doing a little bit of internal family systems. We're saying how there's this hurt child in him that wasn't seen, right? And was ashamed of who he was, right? Nobody accepted. And so he learned the safest thing to do is to fake it. So to mask, pretend, he has a very jovial surface, right? But doesn't let anybody in to know the real him, right? And it's so interesting because, I think, because he tells me a lot about his friends and stuff, but I think therapy, and I only see him like once every 2 months, but that's sort of the only experience that he has that he allows himself to be seen because it's safe, right? And it's like, he doesn't experience this, but it's only like once every 2 months, right? It's not a lot. But yeah. So Bowlby argued that attachment styles established by age 2 determine how individuals relate to others and to the world for the remainder of their lives, right? Unless you set about changing it, right? One thing that I was when Kate was reading about the if you're in a difficult relationship, can you heal? Right. One thing that I was thinking about is we often talk about, how people, there's these patterns. There's what we call downward spirals. There's just kind of repeating and not going anywhere. And then there's upward spirals. So there's benign, or there's another term for it, but there's well, you spiral downwards, you can spiral upwards, or you can stay the same. And I'll explain what that means. What you see often as people are doing this work and they're healing is that, their patterns of relationships were really difficult, were really abusive, right? And they don't go from having a really abusive pattern of relationship and engaging in that to having a completely healthy pattern of relationship. What you see is that it just gets, the next relationship is a little bit better and they have more boundaries, right? And the next relationship is a little bit better. And so they're kind of on this upward path. They're still repeating the patterns, but it's a little bit better each time, right? And you often see that. You don't see like going from, a very toxic sort of pattern of relationship and, now you're in a perfectly healthy relationship. You see it change slowly, right? Okay. So question, were there other important figures that contributed to attachment theory? So far we've talked about Bowlby, and he's considered the father of attachment theory. But Mary Ainsworth is considered the mother, and this is like a bit of a patriarchal thing because Bowlby gets a lot more credit than Ainsworth. But Ainsworth, if you're trying to be objective, right? She made huge contributions. She's kind of like second fiddle to Bowlby, but she made contributions that were at least as important, if not more important than Bowlby to attachment theory. But she was very self-effacing also. So Mary Ainsworth, contributions to attachment theory was as important as Bowlby's, whereas Bowlby was more of a theoretician. Okay? Ainsworth is more of an experimenter. So she went out there and worked with kids and did experiments and tried things. So she was born in the USA, but she moved to Canada at a young age. She was close to her father, but not to her mother. So all these people that became interested in attachment, they had their own issues. They were trying to like figure things out for themselves, right? Which is like very common, people that go into mental health, become mental health professionals. So again, she began studying psychology at University of Toronto in 1929 at the age of 16. Bowlby was 15, he went to medical school. She was 16 when she went to university, okay? So she was not a slouch. In 1942, she joined the Canadian Army and was stationed in Kitchener. And she rose to the rank of major in the Army. After she was discharged, so after the war, she taught at the University of Toronto, where she met her future husband. And she was already, at that time, she was already a PhD. She was a professor. Her husband was doing his PhD, but he wanted to go to England to continue his studies. So she followed her husband, because that's what women did in those days, right? They kind of deferred to their husbands. So she followed him to England, and then he went to Uganda, and she followed him to Uganda, and that's where he completed his PhD training, and he did research in psychology. But he didn't do anything of any consequence, okay? Although he was far more accomplished, she was far more accomplished than he was, she made many personal sacrifices to advance his career. They later divorced. Okay. So during her time in London, before she went to Uganda, she answered an ad and was hired by Bowlby to do research on attachment. And from that time, they became lifelong collaborators. In Uganda, she got a small grant and set out to study how mothers' behavior impacted children's developing personality. So she was living in a little village, agricultural village, farmers, right? And she got to know the mother. She was like a very gregarious person. She got to know the mothers, and every day she could kind of look at the kids, look at the mothers, look at how mothers treated the kids, and see how the kids were developing. It was a little bit like Harlow's monkeys, right? But a naturalistic study. So to do this, she observed the behaviors of mothers and their children in a small rural village. To study attachment, she developed this thing called the strange situation, which I'm going to explain to you, which demonstrated attachment in the real world and allowed research into it. So the strange situation is a way of classifying attachment in kids, all right? And you'll see why. In 1975, she took an academic post at the University of Virginia, and she remained there for the rest of her career. So Ainsworth was also very influenced by Harlow. So Ainsworth's observations of Ugandan mothers, parenting, and its effects on psychosocial development of their children was inspired by Harlow's work with rhesus monkeys. So Harlow noticed that the type of parenting his monkeys received greatly affected their ability to learn, to adapt socially. This observation inspired to carry out the experiments for which he is famous for, in which he raised his monkeys under a series of different conditions, including with their mother, with a cloth mother, with a wire mesh mother. These conditions clearly impacted the monkey's psychosocial development, with those raised with the real mother being the best and those raised with a wire mesh mother the least well-adjusted. So if you put them all, you raise monkeys under different conditions, some with mother, some with a cloth mother, some with a wire mesh mother, and you put them all together after in a big cage when they've grown up, right? And the guys with the wire mesh mother, they seem like so nervous. They're in the corner. They don't interact with anybody. The guys that were raised by their mother, they're well adjusted. They're interacting. They're behaving normally, right? So, what does this tell us about humans, right? But it was a beautiful model. If you want to read a really good book for the holidays, it's super entertaining, but it's so well written. It's Love at Goon Park by Deborah Bloom, and it's all about Ari his life, the research that he did and stuff. At Goon Park. Love at Goon Park, so Goon. So Love at Goon Park by Deborah Bloom, Blum. It's very well written. It's very entertaining. It's hard to put down. Okay. All right. So, I mentioned that Ainsworth came up with this thing called the strange situation, which allowed her to classify children. Because before that, Bowlby didn't have different attachment. He talked about attachment, but he didn't have the different attachment types. He didn't say, oh, there's this type, there's that type. That was all Ainsworth. Bowlby didn't, he said, okay, there's like delinquents, and there's maternal deprivation, but he didn't study the consequences like Ainsworth did. Okay, so what is Ainsworth's strange situation that demonstrates attachment in the real world? Okay. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So Ainsworth's strange situation is a structured lab procedure. Okay, so they bring these kids into the lab with their mother, and it's choreographed. So you go through this exact same sequence of they do these things, and the raters, the psychologists, they're rating what the kids do, and it's on the basis of what kids do in response to these different things that they determine their attachment style. So I'm going to go to the next slide, just because I want to tell you what the steps are. So they're called episodes. So there's different little episodes that they put the kids through. All right. So the first is the beginning. The infant, the caregiver, and the researcher are present in the room. The caregiver and infant are introduced to the room. And then the researcher explains the procedure and then leaves. So this is like an infant, under 2, up to 2 years old. So they just bring the mother in, they introduce the mother and the child, the infant to the room, and then, he leaves, right? The researcher leaves. So then there's episode 2, which is called free play. And who's present? It's the infant and caregiver alone in the room, right? The infant is encouraged to explore the toys in the room by the mother. And this was, I'm going to say the mother, because it was always the mother. It was hardly ever the father. The caregiver is told to respond only if the child initiates interaction. Okay. And the purpose is to establish a baseline for the child's exploration and use of the caregiver as a secure base. Okay. Remember, we're talking about that image of the boat and the harbor. And what does the boat do if the weather's good? The boat is out exploring, right? It's only when there's danger that the boat needs to come back to the harbor. So these kids, obviously it's a strange situation, but it's not threatening. It's like a nice room, there's toys and stuff. So the kids are just exploring because they're not afraid, most kids, right? So that's the second episode. Then the third episode is a stranger enters. So who's present is the infant, the caregiver, and the stranger. A stranger enters, talks to the caregiver, and then gradually approaches the infant. So you can kind of imagine, this is like introducing a little bit of a threat. This is a stranger, right? Caregiver then leaves the room quietly, leaving the child alone with the stranger, right? The purpose is to assess how the child reacts to a stranger with and without the caregiver present. So they're testing the child, testing how the child reacts. That's how they determine the attachment style. So then the fourth episode is the first separation. Who's present? Infant and stranger. The infant is left alone with the stranger. The stranger may try to comfort or play with the infant if they're distressed. And the purpose is to observe the infant's separation anxiety and how they respond to comfort from the stranger. All right. And there's a few more episodes. So the fifth episode is the first reunion. Who's present? Infant and caregiver. The caregiver returns and comforts the infant if needed. The stranger leaves. Purpose to assess the infant's reaction to reunion. Do they seek contact, resist, or avoid the caregiver? All right. Sixth episode is the second separation. Who's present? The infant alone. So the infant and the child and the caregiver were there. Now the caregiver leaves again, second time. So the caregiver leaves the room again, leaving the infant alone. The purpose, this is often the most stressful part of the procedure. It reveals the child's ability to self-soothe or cope with distress. Seventh episode, the stranger returns. So who's present? Infant and stranger. So the infant was alone, and now instead of the caregiver, it's the stranger that returns. So who's present? The infant and stranger. The stranger re-enters and may try to comfort or engage the infant. The purpose of this is to assess the infant's ability to be soothed by someone other than the caregiver. All right. And the last episode 8 is a second reunion. Who's present? Infant and caregiver. The caregiver returns and the stranger leaves. The caregiver comforts the infant if needed. Purpose, this is the most critical episode for determining attachment style based on how the infant reacts to the caregiver's return. Okay, so that's what they go through. And every time with every infant, it's exactly the same thing. And the psychologists, they become very skilled, so they have to have a lot of training. But they're very skilled at observing how the child reacts. And this is how the child reacts. Okay, and so Ainsworth, based on our observations, came up with 3 attachment styles. Okay? And they're called securely attached, avoidant insecure, okay, and resistant insecure. So there's 1 secure and 2 insecure. And you'll see, I call type A, I call it anxious, and type C, I call it avoidant. I'll tell you why, but there's a lot of confusion about these terms. So let's see what these kids did in that strange situation. So with the securely attached kids, they explore the room when they first come into the room. Then they're subdued when the mother leaves, and they greet mom positively when she returns. And generally, the mom is sensitive. Okay, the avoidant kids, okay, did not orientate to their mother while investigating the room. what that means is that the secure kids, they're kind of looking back at the mother and kind of going, taking cues from the mother, and the mother's like, yeah, it's okay, go ahead. Okay. These avoidant kids, they're not looking back. They're not looking at the mother. They're just kind of like exploring on their own without looking back, right? Because, you know, kids do that. They look back to their parents, right? When the mother returns, so there's a couple of returns, but when the mother returns, these avoidant kids have very little interest in their mom. Compare that to the secure kids that greeted their mother positively. The avoidant kids, mom returns, they don't go to her to try to get comfort. They kind of go, whatever. They keep doing whatever they're doing. And those moms sometimes ignored the child. That's the mom's behavior, right? And then you have, then you have the anxious, so the resistant and secure, and their behavior. So the avoidant, they don't react very much. The anxious, they react a lot. So they have intense distress, especially when the mother isn't there. They get very distressed. That's the anxious attached. They reject the mom. So when the mom returns to try to comfort them, they go, no, I don't want you. The secure, they greet the mother positively. The avoidant don't care. And the anxious reject the mother when she returns, tries to comfort them. Okay. And with the anxiously attached, the mom behaves ambivalently towards the child. You know, sometimes like she's warm, sometimes she's not. Right? Okay. All right. So skip over that. Now, the other thing that let's look at the time. Oh, we're okay. So the other thing that Ainsworth did is Ainsworth studied the parents. Right? Remember, she was doing her work in Uganda and was studying these moms. So she studied the moms. What were the characteristics? Because she did the strange situation with the kids and determined their attachment style. So what were the characteristics of the mothers? And one thing she did, she studied mostly the mothers of secure children. All right. So Ainsworth also studied the parents of securely attached children, wondering what parental characteristics promoted secure attachment. Because secure attachment is the attachment you want, right? Secure attachment means that those kids trust their mother has their back. Trust their mother is there. She's reliable. She's like the safe harbor. You know, when there's danger, you know, the harbor is there. When there's no danger, they can go out of the harbor and explore. All right. So what were the characteristics of these parents that were safe harbors? So she found that the parents of securely attached children scored high on scales of sensitivity, the ability to correctly interpret and respond appropriately to the infant's signals. So they're cued in, they're paying attention. Okay, they kind of read what kids were feeling and thinking. Acceptance. The warmth, affection, care, comfort, concern, nurturance, support, or simply love that children experience from their parents and other caregivers. Cooperation, the extent to which the parent helps the child work towards their appropriate goals. Emotional accessibility involves the parent actively listening, empathizing with, understanding, and appropriately responding to a child's emotions. So the parents of securely attached children provided what, if you remember, Baumrind, we talked about, you know, she was the one who classified parents into authoritative, authoritarian, neglectful, and warm but no structure, which is warm, no structure. What's that called? Sorry, permissive. Thank you, permissive. Okay. All right. So that's what these parents were. These parents were warm and structured. All right. Now, I have to show this. I've shown it every year, and it's a wonderful little video. You guys remember this? It's a wonderful little video. Because this demonstrates a mother's like amazingly attuned. to this kid. Okay, so I mean, this video is so kind of heartbreaking.
Today you did not make a smart choice. So you hurt my feelings by not going outside, so that's why I didn't want to make this a smart choice. You know, earlier I couldn't go outside, so I was still a little sad.
Yeah,
hmm
but that was a consequence.
But after I was a little sad, I was a little bit upset. More than a little.
More than a little upset?
hmm
Yeah. We all get upset sometimes.
Yeah.
We don't get what we want all the time.
Mama also don't. Papa also don't. But it's hard for babies to do that. They're still babies. They don't understand they have to not do that. You know, earlier, baby dropped the plate and Papa got angry at her, and I told Papa to make this. I told Papa to stop breathe slow and make a smart choice for Papa.
And then did he do it?
Yeah, but earlier I chose to be a tiny bit mad, but after a while I was okay.
You were okay?
Life
is like that. We get upset, we get mad, we cry.
That's emotions, Mama.
That's emotions, I know. And then we feel better after we cry.
Yep. You do, even when you're upset or angry. Always different kinds of feelings. Even though when you're scared.
That's another emotion.
Yeah, a different kind of emotion. No, I was wrong. Today, I had a hard time doing my emotions.
Yeah,
Yeah, it is today.
that's okay.
But it means,
We're learning.
but
You're learning
when-
also.
even though when I was that mad, you still love me that so much.
Of course. Always.
Yeah, I love you too.
Yeah. All right. I'm not going to make any comments on that. Kind of speaks for itself. Okay. We're just going to do a little bit more. We'll break in about 5-10 minutes, okay? I want to do the child thing because then we're going to leave the adult for the second half. Adult attachment. Okay. All right. So, so far we've talked about 3 attachment styles, right? And I'm not going to use the terms that they use, and I'll explain why. But I'm going to use the terms secure, avoidant, and anxious. Because if you start using like 2 words, it's too much for me. So Ainsworth came up with 3 attachment styles: secure, avoidant, and resistant or anxious. That's the question. Is there only 3 attachment styles? What's that? No. Okay. So there was a second generation of attachment theorists, of which Mary Main was one of the most important. So Mary Main, born 1943 and still alive, was a professor of psychology at the University of California. Main introduced the 4th attachment style, which she called disorganized, to add to Ainsworth's secure, avoidant, and resistant. So disorganized children do not fit in the other 3 classifications. So when you're doing the strain situation, it's like you can't, the psychologists are trying to, they just like their behaviors like doesn't fit into the other patterns, right? So they couldn't classify into those 3. So they called it, this is disorganized. In the strain situation, they appear confused and exhibit contradictory behaviors, such as calling a caregiver and backing away or freezing when the caregiver enters the room. So that was kind of main work for, or most of the work that Main did was developing that 4th style. But she also introduced, she along with a couple of other people, a thing called the Adult Attachment Interview, a coding system for assessing attachment styles in adults. Because we only had, the strange situation, which assessed attachment style in infants, right? But she developed a way of coding attachment styles when you're an adult, right? So those are the two big things that she did. So what are disorganized attachment people or children? What they like? So as children, they fear close proximity to parents who can be physically or emotionally abusive. They have a mixture of avoidant and resistant or aggressive behaviors in proximity to parent, little or no sense of safety in relationships, complete inability to self-regulate emotion, and they seem dazed, dissociated, or confused. So that's in the as infants in the strange situation. And as adults, people with disorganized attachment fear close proximity or intimacy in relationships, fear showing vulnerability. They have extreme rage or anger response to confrontation or threat, express little or no empathy with others, and have little or no understanding of personal boundaries. Okay, and we're going to talk about how does that come about? What kind of parenting? Because we talked about the parenting that more likely to lead to a secure attachment. What kind of parenting is more likely to lead to disorganized attachment? We're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, so that's a little bit what happens in the strange situation. Okay, and we're almost at the break. So we talked about 4 different attachment styles, and the 4 attachment styles can be mapped. Psychologists like these different grids, horizontal axis and vertical axis. So the 4 attachment styles can be mapped along a vertical axis of low to high proximity seeking. So that is, how intensely do infants seek contact with an attachment figure, right? So the anxious children, they don't leave the parent, right? The secure children, they're kind of like in between. They're okay, they go to the parent, but they can kind of go away as well. So they know the parent is there. The avoidant children, low proximity seeking, they don't go to the parent at all. Right, so you have proximity seeking. How do you seek? What proximity do you seek to your parent when there's like a danger? That's one thing. Okay, so low to high abandonment anxiety. Okay, so low to high proximity seeking. How intensely do infants seek contact with an attachment figure? And the horizontal axis is low to high abandonment anxiety, which means how intensely do infants react when left by an attachment figure? Okay, so again, if you have an avoidant child, you can kind of guess. Avoidant child, the parent leaves, doesn't react much. Okay, the anxious child, when the parent leaves, he reacts a lot. And the secure child is somewhere in between. And the disorganized child, who knows? Right? So, anxious infants are fearful of being abandoned and seek close relationships. Okay, I'm just reiterating what I said. Avoidant infants have little fear of being abandoned and do not seek close relationships. Disorganized infants are fearful of being abandoned and waver between seeking close relationships and then distancing themselves from the relationships. And these infant patterns hold in adulthood. So if you, it's not like it can happen, we'll talk about that in a second, but if you have a certain attachment style when you're an infant, that stays with you because those patterns remain. Okay? And you're going to have those same attachment styles with partners as an adult. Okay? It can change. We'll talk about that in a minute. And this is the last thing before we break. So can you explain again the evolutionary purpose of attachment? So as I said already, attachment is an instinct, and like all the other instincts, it promotes survival. Instincts evolved over millions of years. They didn't evolve in the last 500 years, right? Because the last 500 years, things have changed a lot, right? As these instincts were evolving, we were hunter-gatherers. We were, primates. And if a primate, if there was like they were in trouble or there was enough food, what would they do? They'd abandon their child, their baby, right? And there was no CAS, there was no police, there are no consequences in those days, right? That was just what happened, right? So there was a lot of child abandonment. Now that doesn't happen so much anymore, right? It's more like neglect, right? So the attachment instinct is that unless you form a strong bond with a caregiver because you're helpless, you can't fend for yourself when you're a baby, you're toast. So that's the attachment instinct, right? All right. Human infants have a long period of immaturity and helplessness during which they need the protection of a caregiver in order to survive. This hinges on attachment and its parental counterpart, caregiving. So it's called attachment on the part of the child. The instinct in parents is called caregiving, not called attachment. I call it attachment, but if you're going to be correct, it's called caregiving on the part of the parent and attachment on the part of the child. So one metaphor for the role of attachment in the child's psychosocial development is that of a boat which needs a safe harbor from which to explore the sea and to which it can return regularly, but especially during turbulent times, right? When there's danger. So the boat and the harbor. If the harbor is safe and accessible, Erikson's trust, mistrust, and autonomy stages, the boat is more likely to feel safe, to leave the harbor and explore the sea. Autonomy, exploring the sea's autonomy, saying no to the harbor, but returning there when needed. That's H2, right? So that's secure attachment. The harbor is safe and accessible. The boat is going to explore, but can return. It can say no, right? It can develop. Without a safe harbor, the boat never strays far from land. That's anxious attachment. It's hard to get into the harbor, so it doesn't want to leave, or leaves land behind altogether and spends all its time alone in the dangerous seas. That's avoidant attachment, right? If both the harbor and the sea are dangerous, the boat is not sure where to go. It runs away from both the danger of the harbor, because the harbor is dangerous, and the danger of the sea, where there's storms and stuff. It has nowhere else to go and wanders apparently aimlessly between the harbor and the sea. That's disorganized attachment. When the harbor is unsafe, inaccessible, or dangerous, attachment disorders arise and the child's psychosocial development is impaired. Trust in the safety of the harbor, that is in the caregivers, is the foundation upon which Erikson's subsequent stages of psychosocial development are built. So attachment is vital if you're going to develop psychosocially, right? So that's why it's so important in personality development, right? It's trust versus mistrust, the first stage of Erikson's 8 stages, right? And the other ones we've talked about, if you don't have trust, it's going to be hard to be autonomous, right? Because you can't separate, right? It's hard to do all the other things that Erikson talked about. So attachment disorders are disorders of trust. Attachment disorders are disorders of trust. That's really important. So if you have, an attachment disorder, you have a disorder, you don't trust well. Doesn't mean that you don't trust, because like what happens with people with attachment disorders is that it's more like their trust meter is broken. If you have secure attachment, your trust meter works very well, right? So you tend to be drawn to people who are trustworthy. Not always, but you tend to kind of like, you have like a radar. If you have secure attachment, you're drawn to people who are trustworthy. If you have an insecure form of attachment, your trust meter is broken. So you sometimes think that people are trustworthy, but they're not, right? Or some people are trustworthy and you don't trust them. So your trust meter is broken, right? So people say, oh, but I trust too much. That's a problem. Your trust meter is broken. So trusting too much is also a problem because you get into a lot of problems, right? And you hear those stories over and over again. Okay. And I think, okay. Sorry? No? Okay. So the attachment system is a survival circuit. When we sense physical or emotional danger, it is automatically activated to seek closeness with a protective figure, thereby finding safety through connection. When faced with a threat, conflict, separation, rejection, and danger, people tend to fall into predictable patterns shaped by their early attachment, learning, and styles. The securely attached reach out for closeness while staying regulated. They communicate their needs clearly, accept comfort, and recover balance after reassurance. They trust that connection will restore safety. The anxiously attached attachment signals are hyperactivated. They protest, cling, demand reassurance, and become preoccupied with the partner's availability. They seek closeness intensely, but feel perpetually unsure that it will last. The avoidantly attached attachment signals are deactivated. They withdraw, minimize feelings, distract with work or solitude, and insist on self-reliance. They suppress their need for comfort and create emotional distance. The disorganizedly attached are conflicted between whether to approach or avoid the attachment figure. They may seek comfort, but simultaneously push it away, alternating between clinging and withdrawal and showing sudden anger or shutdown. Connection is both longed for and feared, leading to confusion and instability. So today there's going to be a poll, and we'll hand that out after the break, okay? Asking you to name your attachment style. There's 5 questions, but that's one of them. If you didn't have a chance to do the attachment style questionnaire that we suggested last week, ask yourself as we go through the following descriptions, what kind of harbor your caregivers provided for you when you answer that question. So imagine that each of us begins life as a small sailing boat on a vast ocean. Our attachment figures, parents, caregivers, partners later in life are our harbors. When the waters are calm, we can explore, grow, and sail far. But when storms come, fear, loneliness, illness, stress, we instinctively look for a stable harbor where we can anchor safely. Attachment styles reflect what kind of harbor we learned we had. So this is the description of the harbor in secure attachment. So secure attachment is a good harbor. It's reliable, open, and safe. The entrance is wide and calm. The lights are clear. The caregivers signal, you're welcome here. I'm glad you came back. The ship can leave to explore the world knowing it can always return. Securely attached people believe, if I'm in distress, someone will come. I'm worth caring for. The world is navigable. They develop confidence both in seeking closeness and exploring independently. The anxiously attached, the harbor is difficult to enter. The harbor exists, but the entrance is unpredictable. Sometimes the gates are open, sometimes closed. The boat circles repeatedly, unsure, will they let me in? The storm outside feels terrifying because safe anchorage is never guaranteed. When the harbor does open, the ship clings tightly, afraid to leave again. Anxiously attached people learn that care is inconsistent. They feel, I need reassurance constantly. If I move away, I might lose the harbor forever. I must stay close, or I won't be safe. Their system remains tuned to fear or abandonment. Avoidantly attached. The harbor, it's impossible to enter. Here, the harbor looks like a possibility from afar, but as the ship approaches, there's no opening. No one signals back. The ship learns to weather storms alone, eventually stops trying to approach at all. Avoidantly attached people learned early that seeking comfort doesn't work. They believe the harbor never really helps. I'm safer relying on myself. Neediness is dangerous, so they sail alone, especially when seas get rough. And finally, disorganized attachment is a dangerous harbor. The harbor is deeply confusing. The harbor is where the ship should be safe, but there are jagged rocks, unpredictable waves, even storms inside the harbor itself. Approaching the harbor brings relief and danger. The ship doesn't know whether to anchor or flee. Its compass becomes unpredictable. Safety and threat are mixed. People with disorganized attachment have caregivers that were frightened, unpredictable, or chaotic. They learned my source of safety is also a source of fear. I don't know how to find refuge. I must protect myself from the very people I need. This leads to contradictory behaviors, seeking closeness and then panicking, freezing, or pushing away. Okay, so let's stop there for a break. I don't want to postpone that too much. Let's think. Okay. So we just have a little bit more before we turn to attachment in adults, because mostly this has been attachment in children, infants. Okay, let me read that slide. So when we interact with our environment, we can be calm and in the window of tolerance, socially engaged, and that's called discovery mode. That's like the ship that goes out into the sea and explorers, right? In this physiological state, we are curious, explore, take risks, engage in play, learn, and try new things. Alternatively, we can be outside the window of tolerance, fight or flight, threat detection, survival, or defend mode. Okay, defend mode is when your attachment is activated. That's when you want to go back to the harbor. This kicks in when people feel a threat, danger, or anxiety. In defend mode, a person is worried, alert to harm, reactive, cautious, and often shrinks back instead of expanding outwards. Chronic defend mode means persistent anxiety, fear, and avoidance. So children need caregivers who make them feel safe by being responsive and consistent. So, the kids might be afraid, but if they come into the harbor, right, the harbor is safe and the threat is dealt with, right? From this secure base, they can feel confident to explore the world, knowing they have a safe relationship to return to if something goes wrong. Over the last few decades, as the world has in fact become safer for children, because the world has become safer for children, caregivers have come to believe that the threats children face in the world are much greater and have become overprotective. Modern parenting in many places has tilted too far towards safety concerns, limiting free play and autonomy. This has several consequences. Children are more fragile because they have not benefited from immunization, anti-fragility, effects of manageable adversity. So, it's kind of like when, when you're a little baby, if there's a threat, you want to return to the harbor. But as you grow older, you're able to stay in the sea, even when it gets a little rougher. Like, you still want to come back, right? But if you learn to sail rougher seas, you can soothe yourself. You don't need to return to the harbor so quickly, right? So that's the idea, is anti-fragility, developing that ability to cope with rougher seas. But obviously, it's still good to have like a safe harbor to return to. It's good to do both, to have a safe harbor, but also to be able to, sail rougher seas, right? Okay, okay. Children are also less able to move into explore and discovery mode. They're remaining close to home emotionally, less able or willing to take risks, and more likely to go into defend mode. All right. Now, I think this, you probably already got a bit of an idea that we talked about Diane Baumrine's parenting styles. So those closely correspond with attachment styles, right? So if you have authoritative parenting, which is consistent, so it's warm and responsive and structured, you're more likely to have secure attachment. Okay. If you have authoritarian parenting, so authoritarian is cold but structured, you're more likely to have avoidant because there's no warmth. There's no point getting, trying to get warm. It just doesn't exist, right? If you have permissive parenting, which is warm but unstructured, you're more likely to have anxious attachment. And if you have uninvolved parenting, which is frightening, emotionally unreachable, more likely to have disorganized attachment. Okay. And these numbers vary, but this is a little bit, if you go different countries in the world, what is the breakdown? What percentage of people have secure? What percentage have ambivalent, avoidant, and disorganized? And on the right, it's kind of like an average. And on the left, that table is different countries. So, and it lists the number of studies that were done in each country and the percentage of secure, insecure, and anxious and avoidant, right? So roughly, if you look at the bottom, the numbers in red, about 65% of people in the world are secure. 21% are avoidant, 14% are anxious. And that study didn't list the disorganized. Okay, so we did that. All right, so far we've talked about attachment in infants and children. Is attachment also important in adult mental health? All right, so let's talk about attachment in adults. All right. So if you look at the literature, these are the terms that are actually used. So A is ambivalent resistant. I call that anxious. Okay. B is secure. So the letters go with it, right? So sometimes you'll see psychologists that use the letters instead of using the terms. So there's A, B, C, and D styles, right? But I don't use that because you're not going to remember if I say B, you're not going to remember that's secure. So I'll say secure. C is avoidant and D is disorganized. That's in infants. But then in the adult literature, the ambivalent resistant becomes anxious preoccupied. It's very hard to keep that straight. Why did they change, the two scales or the two tests? Why did they change the names, right? And secure, it's easy, it's still secure. The avoidant in infants and adults, it's dismissing avoidant, okay? And the disorganized in adults is called fearful avoidant. Okay, so it's very confusing. I find that very confusing. So when in the course we refer to types of attachment, we're not going to distinguish between infant and adult styles. So when you hear secure, we mean secure in children and adults. When you hear anxious, we mean ambivalent resistant in children and anxious preoccupied in adults. I'm just going to call it anxious to reduce the confusion. When you hear avoidant, we mean avoidant in children and dismissing avoidant in adults. When you hear disorganized, we mean disorganized in children and fearful avoidant in adults. Right? So just to keep it simpler. Does that make sense to people? Sort of? Yeah? More or less? Yeah? Okay. Don't worry about it. I've met people that when I use these 4 terms, they kind of think I'm a troglodyte. I like that word. I had to use it. Do you know what a troglodyte is? It's like a caveman. Yeah. Okay. Because I don't use the right proper terms. So note that while in the majority of people, attachment style remains the same over the course of a lifetime, in a significant percentage, it changes. This is called earned secure and earned insecure. This change often occurs in the context of intimate relationships. And one study, for example, found that 22% of partners changed their attachment style in the first 2 years of marriage. Okay, so you can go one way or the other. So now we talked about how the strange situation is how you classify infants, right? But how do you classify adults? So there's 2 reliable ways to determine attachment styles: the strange situation in infants, which we already discussed, and the adult attachment inventory in adults. The adult attachment inventory was devised by George Kaplan and Mary Main. We already talked about. That was done in 1984. It consists of 60 to 90-minute interviews composed of 18 questions designed to assess an adult's childhood experiences and their current state of mind with regards to attachment. So when you do those tests online, that's not this, right? It's not like reliable. It's kind of an approximation. Some of the examples of the questions in the inventory: can you give me 5 adjectives to describe your early relationships with your mother and father? What happened to you when you were emotionally upset or physically hurt? How have these experiences influenced the kind of person you are today? Adult attachment inventories are transcribed verbatim and coded according to a classification system. And it requires lengthy and expensive training if you want to do this classification. So it's difficult to get it. I don't know anybody who's ever done this other than, for research purposes. That's what it actually looks like. Okay, so let's talk quickly about earned or acquired secure attachment. So acquired secure attachment refers to a state in adulthood or later adolescence in which a person who did not grow up with secure attachment nevertheless becomes secure through later corrective experiences, intentional healing, or stable relational environments. It is earned rather than established in infancy. This is often called earned security in the adult attachment interview literature. So I've kind of moved from being more avoidant, because I was very avoidant, okay, and not kind of more earned secure. You can shift, and it's not like 100%, but you can shift a little bit. People with acquired secure attachment typically have histories of adversity, inconsistency, or trauma, but have made sense of their experiences. They show a capacity for coherence, reflective narratives about childhood, and even if the childhood is painful, they demonstrate resilience, emotional flexibility, and self-soothing. Even though these skills were not modeled in childhood, they can form stable, reciprocal, emotionally attuned relationships in adulthood. Research shows that earned secure adults resemble secure adults in present-day functioning, relationships, parenting, and emotional regulation. The pathway to earned secure is typically through a later attachment figure, for example, a romantic partner, a therapist, a stable mentor, or a close friend. These later secure relationships provide the missing experiences of safety, attunement, and being known, allowing the person to reconsolidate how they see themselves and others. Acquired secure attachments associated with lower rates of depression and anxiety, improved parenting sensitivity, higher reflective functioning, and greater neural integration. In essence, early wounds are reorganized when the nervous system encounters reliable, safe connections. All right? So this is like, the best thing for your mental health is not going to see a therapist, but is being with a secure partner. Okay? If they can tolerate you, right? If they can stay with you, it's very helpful. So if you don't want to pay for therapy, find a secure partner. Okay. Now there's the other thing that happens also, which is earned or acquired insecure. It goes the other way. So earned or acquired insecure attachment is the mirror phenomenon of earned secure, a person who began life with secure attachment, but who later becomes insecure in adulthood due to chronic stress, trauma, betrayal, abandonment, or prolonged relational instability. It reflects a loss of trust in the reliability of others and in one's own internal working models. People with acquired insecure attachment often previously functioned securely, often well into adulthood, but show a gradual or sudden shift towards avoidant, ambivalent, or disorganized adaptations. They experience changes in emotional regulation, such as heightened anxiety, emotional numbing, hypervigilance, or compulsive self-reliance. They struggle to maintain stable relationships that once came naturally. Research shows that major rupture events such as loss, betrayal, abusive relationships, chronic invalidation, or traumatic stress can undermine previously secure states. This may result in a collapse of the internal working model, such that the person no longer expects comfort to be available, no longer trusts their own worth, and no longer anticipates consistency. So acquired insecurity is linked to higher rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD, increased physiological stress responsivity, reduced reflective functioning, and shifts in caregiving representations. All right. Importantly, this form of insecurity is not fixed. It can be reorganized. Attachment is always developmental, not a life sentence, so it can change. All right. So just briefly on this, some attachment researchers see attachment styles as dimensions, not category. So you're not like either secure or avoidant or disorganized or anxious. You might be like 20% this, 30% this. I think that's more realistic, right? Because see, like in infants, the strange situation, it was with one caregiver, right? So it was the mother, but you might have a different caregiver in the strange situation, like a grandparent or the father, and the child might react differently, and they might show like a different attachment style with a different caregiver, right? Does that make sense? So people might have like a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And with some people, they might react more anxious. With other people, they might be more secure. Okay. So that's like just a little wrinkle in this. All right. So let's talk about attachment and how it manifests over the lifespan, right? So we owe a lot of what we know about attachment in adult to this guy, Alan Sroufe. Sroufe was the founder and principal investigator of the Minnesota longitudinal study of parents and children. So, a few weeks ago, I mentioned that Harvard study. This is like next to the Harvard study, this is one of the best longitudinal studies that's been done in psychology and psychiatry. So the Minnesota longitudinal study of parents and children began in 1975, and and continues to the present. All right, so that's like over 50 years that they're studying this population. The Minnesota longitudinal study recruited a sample of 267 first-time mothers in their third trimester of pregnancy through the many Minneapolis Public Health Department branches. Wide-ranging assessments of the mother's characteristics, circumstances, parental expectations, and prenatal care were carried out when the mothers were recruited into the study. Okay, the study focused on social relationships, relationship experiences, what people think about their experiences, risk and protective factors, and issues of continuity and change. So the goal of the study has been to trace the course of individual development and to understand the factors that led towards good outcomes or poor outcomes as adults, right? The investigators studied how people developed at different points in their lives and across diverse settings. Many of the study's findings are summarized in the book, The Development of the Person, and that's the picture there of the book. The investigators continue to assess mothers and children after the birth of the child. In infancy, assessments of parents, children's temperaments, and observations of parent-child interactions were carried out at birth, at 3, 6, and 12 months. Thereafter, assessments are conducted every 6 months until ages 2.5, yearly through 3rd grade, 3 times between ages 9 and 13, and at ages 16, 17.5, 19, 23, 26, and 28. Okay, so these are very detailed. They collected so much data to see how people were developing. Right? Anybody see 26 Up, where it was like, first it was 7 Up, and then it was like 14 Up. Have you seen that documentary? Oh, it's British. So it's kind of the informal version. Did you see it? No, it's the informal version of this study. It was these documentary guys who, I think the first documentary was kids were 7 years old. So they went and they filmed a bunch of different kids and gave a little description of what their lives were like. And then they went back every 7 years to follow up. And then in documentaries, they had kind of a little for each kind. Oh, this is what they were like when they were kids. And this is like 14. And there's 21, there's 28. I don't know if there's any other than 28. I think 28 might have been the last one, but maybe somebody can look it up. But 26 Up was the last one. Yeah. That's okay. You can tell us after. So that was kind of the documentary version. This is the academic version. So these are good studies. Okay. So I'm going to go over this a little bit with you because I think this is an important slide. Sorry to, and this you already know. Okay, what this slide is about, it looks at, this is summarizes the findings of the Minnesota longitudinal study, very briefly, okay? It tells us what the mother was like, the baby was like, what happened to strange situations. So we're kind of probably skip over those because we already talked about that. But then it tells us what the secure kids were like at preschool, what the avoidant kids were like at preschool, the ambivalent kids were like at preschool. What the teachers said about the kids, what the kids were at age 6, what the kids were in mid-childhood, and what kids were like in adulthood. Okay, so let's look at that. I'm going to skip over this, but just to give you an example. So the mother of secure kids is warm, sensitively attuned, consistent, responds quickly to the baby's cries. And the baby readily explores using mother as a secure base, cries least of the 3 groups, most compliant with mother, most easily put down after being held. In the strange situations, secure kids actively seeks mother when distressed, maintains contact on reunion, readily comforted. Okay, what are these kids like? The secure kids, what are they like in preschool? Easily makes friends, they're popular, flexible, and resilient under stress, spends more time with peers, and they have good self-esteem in preschool. What did the teachers say about them? The teachers treat these kids in warm, matter-of-fact, age-appropriate ways. What are these kids like? So that was preschool, so they would have been like 3 or 4. What are they like at age 6? With parents, they are warm and enthusiastic, able to be open and to engage in meaningful exchanges, comfortable with physical contact. What are these kids like in mid-childhood? They form close friendships and can sustain them in larger peer groups. So it makes you think about the Harlow's monkeys a little bit. Okay, what are they like as adults? So they have easy access to wide range of feelings and memories, positive and negative, balanced view of parents, if insecure in childhood, has worked through hurt and anger, usually has securely attached children. Okay, so that's what secure kids grow up to be as adults. That's what the study, Minnesota longitudinal study, that's what it shows. That's just very brief summary of the studies. So you already know that avoidant kids, the mother is often emotionally unavailable or rejecting, dislikes the neediness of the kids, and may applaud independence. That's mothers are like. The baby, by the end of the first year, baby seeks little physical contact with mother, randomly angry with her, and responsive to being held, but often upset when put down. And what are they like in the strain situation? Avoids mother when distressed, seems blasé. Okay, so that doesn't need comfort. What are these kids like in preschool? Often angry, aggressive, defiant, maybe isolated, disliked, hangs around teachers, withdraws when in pain. And with teachers, they become controlling and angry. What are they like at age 6? With parents, they are abrupt, neutral, unenthusiastic exchanges, absence of warmth, and absence of physical contact. Mid-childhood, they have no close friends or friendships, marked by exclusivity, jealousy, often isolated from the group. And as adults, dismissing of the importance of love and connection, often idealizes parents, but actual memories don't corroborate. Shallow, if any, self-reflection, usually has avoidantly attached children. All right, and let's look at the ambivalent. And, the interesting thing is the study, there's no disorganized, again, right? So it's too bad. So the ambivalent kids, the mother is unpredictable or chaotic. So that's the anxious, right? Often attentive, but out of sync with baby, most tuned into baby's fear. And the baby cries a lot, is clinging and demanding, often angry, upset by small separations, chronically anxious in relation to mother, and limited in exploration. All right. And straight situation, difficult to soothe after separation, angry and seeking comfort simultaneously. And what are they like in preschool? Regretful and easily overwhelmed by anxiety, immature, overly dependent on teacher, may be victimized by bullies. Teachers indulge, excuse, and infantilize them. Age 6, mixes intimacy seeking with hostility. Affect is cute or ingratiating, may be worried about mother when apart. And mid-childhood, trouble functioning in peer groups, difficulty sustaining friendships when in larger groups. And as adults, still embroiled with anger and hurt at parents, unable to see own responsibility in relationships, dreads abandonment, usually has ambivalent attached children. Okay, so it's a really interesting study. I mean, again, holiday reading, I don't know, but it's a good book. So we've talked about some of the problems that arise from insecure types of attachment, but are there benefits of having secure attachment? So what does having secure attachment, what does that do for you? So these are called the gifts of secure attachment. Secure attachment contributes to good mental health, and it confers on securely attached adults psychological gifts, which include, so 1, a healthy relationship to yourself, positive self-esteem, and a clear sense of self, a perception of the collection of characteristics that define you. 2, a capacity to self-soothe and stay in the window of tolerance. 3, a capacity for healthy relationships with others, especially intimate care-based relationships with healthy boundaries and the ability to repair and love. 4, a feeling of purpose in life, a meaningful occupation, connections to nature, and to transpersonal story about the universe. And 5, a relative safety from interpersonal danger. So that means that kids who are securely attached, they're not as prone to being abused or bullied because the parents are responsive. So it's protective from danger from other sources, right? All these are items higher on Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. We'll come back to Maslow's hierarchy, I think after Christmas, or no, next week. So why do people with insecure attachment styles tend to experience more difficulties in close relationships? Okay. So how attachment patterns shape later life relationships. Attachment is a template the nervous system builds in early life for answering 3 questions. So attachment is a template the nervous system builds for answering these 3 questions. One is, am I safe? Okay. Second is, are others reliable? And the third question is, what do I need to do to stay connected? And the early lessons, from our early caregivers become our implicit operating system, right? It's how we answer these 3 questions. They show up later in adulthood as how we see closeness, how we handle conflict, and how we regulate emotions with another person. What we expect from love, what we fear in intimacy, and how we respond to unmet needs. Right? So attachment patterns are not fixed traits. They're survival strategies learned early that continue only until new experiences or healing provides better options. Okay? So that's what, that's why attachment determines our adult relationships, right? Do we feel safe so if you didn't feel safe as a kid, you're not going to feel safe with a partner as an adult, right? If your parents or parental figures weren't reliable, right? Emotionally, even if that person is reliable, you're not going to feel that person is reliable as an adult. Okay? And, if you had to do some stuff, or whatever you had to do as a kid to stay connected, we're going to talk a lot about that. It's like, this is what you do to stay connected as an adult. I think we talked a little bit, when we did the example about what you needed to do to stay connected when we did that practice, because love should be the glue, right? And secure attachment, love is the glue, right? But when that love doesn't work, to stay connected, people start to do all kinds of things like fawn, people please, defer, try to be perfect. So those are all strategies that are substitute for the love glue that people use to try to maintain that attachment. It's not good attachment, right? But it's what they do. And then as adults, that's the same glue that they're going to use with other people because they don't know, they didn't have the experience of love, so they don't not use that glue. So they use the people-pleasing glue, the deference, the fawning glue, the other glues. Okay. So, yeah, we still have a little bit of time. So people often assume that conflicts in intimate relationships, we're going to talk a lot about this when we come to relationships. That's towards the end of the course. And this year, there's a few sessions that I did a major overhaul, and the relationship section, I did a major overhaul. So I think it's vastly improved. So I'm kind of excited, but it's towards the end of the course. So people often assume that conflicts in intimate relationships are mostly related to concrete issues such as disagreements over values, money, politics, sex, houseworking, contributions, raising children. We think that's why we disagree with our partners. However, couples with secure attachment frequently have different views on some of these concrete issues, but if they have a care-based rather than transactional relationship, they can stay well-regulated, use good communication and repair skills, and work out their differences in a mutually satisfactory way. When these issues become a chronic source of conflict, it's often because of underlying attachment issues. So most conflicts in couples are because of it's not because of, the actual things with money or politics or sex, because, if you have secure attachment, you're much more able to work those things out. Okay. Now, it's not 100%, but most issues are based on attachment. Many relationships are very difficult because people don't know what the real nature of their problems has to do with attachment and communication. and don't know how to approach these difficulties, right? So they stay stuck because they don't realize that it's how they relate to others that's really important, not the content, what they're talking about, who did the dishes or who picked up the kids. So common problematic attachment patterns in couples include one partner being more anxious and the other more avoidant. Two, a partner with disorganized style, alternative feeling suffocated and abandoned. Much more on this in our session on relationships. To be effective, couples therapy must be attachment informed. So if you're kind of ignoring that, people's attachment styles, think you're going to have trouble with couples therapy. All right, let's go to a question that we asked earlier. So this question was, I haven't had any contact with my family for 3 years. I'm torn about it, but I feel I need to protect myself from them. I recently heard about family estrangement. Can you tell us more about it? Okay, so I thought it was important to do the, before answering that question, because the person asked that question last week, but I wanted to kind of go through the attachment stuff before answering this question, because there's a lot of attachment in there, okay? So I think it's easier to understand this now. So family estrangement is often described as a relational rupture, but it's more accurate to say it is the end point of a long attachment pattern. Research increasingly shows that estrangement is not random. It follows predictable attachment lines. So estrangement is unlikely in people with secure attachment. So if you have secure attachment, you're unlikely to become estranged, whether from childhood or earned adulthood. Securely attached people tend to have a stable sense of self-worth, moderate expectations of others, capacity for repair after conflict, and a greater emotional flexibility. Their internal working models assume my needs matter and others can be reliable. Because of this, they usually don't need to cut off family member relationships. Even when hurt, secure individuals tend to attempt dialogue, set boundaries, seek mutual understanding, repair ruptures, and move towards connection rather than away. So estrangement among securely attached people is possible, but relatively rare, and usually driven by severe or unsafe circumstances. So estrangement becomes more likely in people with insecure attachment, especially the more dysregulated forms. So people with avoidant patterns tend towards emotional distancing, cope through self-reliance and suppression, may cut off relationships rather than risk vulnerability, and view closeness as dangerous or intrusive. Estrangement for people with avoidant patterns is often a protective strategy. I can't stay connected and stay safe. People with anxious patterns experience high emotional activation in relationships, fear abandonment and rejection, are prone to conflict cycles of boundary testing, and feel overwhelmed by inconsistency. Estrangement in people with anxious patterns often follows repeated cycles of hurt, unmet needs, and emotional exhaustion. Okay, I'm almost done, so hang in there with me. Disorganized attachment is marked by trauma, fear, and contradictory impulses, and it's most strongly associated with estrangement. So disorganized attachment, most strongly associated with estrangement. This is a result of high conflict, difficulty regulating emotions, inability to form predictable patterns of closeness, relationships that oscillate between enmeshment and cutoff, and a fear-based system that sees family as both needed and dangerous. Here, estrangement is often a final survival strategy, not a choice. And then there's like the often overlooked scenario of when someone becomes earned secure. So in their family, they were insecure, but they've become earned secure. So these people become earned secure. They learn that what respectful, because they become learned or earned secure, they've learned what respectful, attuned relating feels like. Their nervous system recalibrates to expect reciprocity. They've developed boundaries that protect their well-being. Their tolerance for mistreatment, manipulation, or emotional neglect drops dramatically, and they become aware of patterns they previously normalized. Meanwhile, their family may be still operating from anxious, avoidant, or disorganized patterns, use old roles like the scapegoat, caretaker, golden child, expect the person to remain in outdated relational scripts, and resist or punish the new, healthier boundaries. This creates an attachment mismatch. Suddenly, the person who is now earned secure can see the insecure dynamics clearly in their family, right? Sometimes for the first time. I thought this was normal. Now I know it's not healthy. I can't go back to pretending. In this case, estrangement is often an act of self-protection and self-respect, not rejection. Okay, so earned secure individuals may initiate estrangement because they want a relational life that reflects their new internal working model, no longer tolerate chronic invalidation or emotional harm, want to protect their mental health and healing trajectory, recognize that repair requires both sides. The family system may be unwilling or unable to change or choose to break generational patterns for the sake of their own children. Estrangement here is often a boundary with compassion, not a punishment. I still care about them, but I can't be in that environment anymore. So people who become earned secure, they're kind of also at risk for estrangement because their families may not have changed. Okay. Last slide here. So is family estrangement on the rise? So a recent survey by Cornell Family Estrangement and Reconciliation Project found that 27% of American adults reported being estranged from one or more family members. Other sources similarly estimate that about 1 in 4, so that's pretty 25%, people have at some point cut off or significantly reduced contact with family. In another study, 6% of adults report estrangement from their mother, and approximately 26 report estrangement from their father. Average age of first estrangement with a parent is often early to mid-20s in some surveys. While many estrangement are with parents, estrangement with siblings appears rarer. One earlier large-scale study cited by researchers estimate that fewer than 5% of Americans are completely estranged from a sibling. Researchers and clinicians believe estrangement's on the rise. The fact that recent surveys identify 20 to 30% plus estrangement rates suggests the phenomenon is surprisingly common. Some authors refer to estrangement as a silent epidemic, drawing a parallel to divorce. Okay, and there was a recent Oprah episode. Did you guys, anybody see that? Did you see? Oh yeah, I sent it to you, right? Yeah, you saw it too. So it's worth watching. Did you get a chance to watch it? Yeah. What'd you think? Yeah.
Especially.
Yeah.
We can't hear whoever's speaking, just a heads up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I found
Oh,
it
thank you.
especially interesting just because I'm estranged from my entire family of origin, and just the different factors that play into that, and I could relate.
So yeah, look it up. It's really well done. Oprah invited 3 experts on estrangement. And there are a lot of audience members that had that experience, and they all contributed. I thought it was good. I'd never kind of listened much to Oprah before, but that was good. Okay, so I'm just looking at the time, and I think we're going to skip this section. Our longstanding mental health issues related to insecure types of attachment, and obviously the answer is yes, right? Do you want me to go over that, or do you want me to go to questions?
Okay, I have to keep an eye on
Who wants me to go over that slide, last slide? Put your hand. Okay, so I think that's a pretty important. So our attachment issues related to mental health diagnosis. That's the last slide. So the core issue of insecure attachment is that when early caregiving is inconsistent, rejecting, or frightening, a child's attachment system doesn't stabilize. Instead of learning, I can depend on others and regulate with them, the child learns strategies to cope with uncertainty or danger. These strategies, anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, are adaptive in the childhood environment, but create vulnerabilities later. They're adaptive because they maintain the attachment, right? But at a cost. So each insecure attachment type shapes an internal working model. So that's how you conceive of yourself and the world, or fundamental emotional belief or map of the world. With anxious attachment, it's, I'm not enough. Others will leave. This leads to hypervigilance, rumination, and dependence. With avoidant attachment, the internal model is my needs are too much. Others won't be there. This leads to suppression, emotional distance, and self-reliance at a cost. With disorganized attachment, the internal model is others are both comfort and danger. This leads to confusion, fragmentation, and fear of intimacy. These internal working models unconsciously guide expectations in adult relationships, work, and self-regulation. These attachment-based strategies can evolve into enduring problems. So anxious attachment is frequently associated with chronic anxiety, depressive episodes, fear of abandonment, and borderline traits. Avoidant attachment is associated with emotional numbness, loneliness, substance use, and depression, while disorganized attachment is associated with dissociation, trauma-related disorders, personality disorder traits, and unstable self-image. These strategies are self-reinforcing. The anxious person clings and gets rejected, which confirms their fears. The avoidant withdraws and feels empty, confirming beliefs about being alone. The disorganized partner both seeks and fears intimacy, creating chaos. Without corrective experiences such as therapy or secure relationships, these cycles repeat and solidify into long-standing mental health issues. Okay. Okay, let me do this because this is good too. I'm sorry. All right. So, because I think we need to do this. So hold the questions for a second, okay? I promise this is the last slide. Promise. Okay. Because this is important. So is insecure attachment always a parenting failure? Because it's easy to say that, right? So when we talk about attachment, it's easy for people to assume that insecure attachment is the result of bad parenting. The reality is more complex and more compassionate. Attachment is a relationship between two nervous systems, the child's and the parents. Sometimes a child brings a temperament so extreme or biologically sensitive that even good, loving, attuned parents struggle to become a source of comfort and safety for that child. Babies come into the world with very different nervous systems. Some infants are extremely reactive to sound, touch, and change, easily overwhelmed, difficult to soothe, and prone to intense distress, even with loving care. This is temperament. It's inborn or wired into the child's biology long before any parenting begins. Think of it like starting life in a stormy little body. Some babies arrive as a gentle breeze and a steady wind, others as a full-blown hurricane. Even caring, attuned parents can struggle to soothe an extremely reactive infant. When a baby's distress is intense, unpredictable, and long-lasting, parents may feel like nothing they do helps. They hold, rock, soothe, feed, sing, but the baby's nervous system remains dysregulated. This means the parents are doing this doesn't mean the parents are doing anything wrong. It means the child's internal system is so activated that co-regulation cannot easily take root, even in a warm home. The attachment that forms may be insecure, but not because of lack of love. If the baby's nervous system continues to flood easily, they might develop anxious attachment because they never feel fully settled or safe. Anxious attachment because being held feels overwhelming, or disorganized attachment if their internal sensations are chaotic or frightening. In these cases, the insecure patterns reflect biology, not a parent's shortcomings. This is especially true in certain situations. Research shows this pattern in highly sensitive infants, infants with neurodevelopmental differences like autism, infants who have had difficult births or early medical trauma, infants with biological or genetic vulnerabilities, and infants with sensory processing challenges. These children sometimes cannot be soothed consistently enough to form secure attachment, even with responsive patterns. Insecure attachment does not always mean neglect, abuse, poor parenting, or lack of love. It sometimes means the child's nervous system struggled to receive comfort, the child's internal world was too overwhelming to settle, and the parent and child simply had a harder time, a starting point. Parents in these situations often love their children fiercely and try incredibly hard. The insecurity reflects the child's early neurobiology, not the parent's heart. This is not to blame the child. Clearly, they did not choose their temperament. It's not a blame game. It's an effort to understand the complexity of the territory. Attachment grows like a plant. Some seeds sprout in any soil. Some seeds need perfect conditions. Some are so sensitive that even with sunlight, water, and care, they still grow in a twisted or fragile way. It's neither the seeds nor the gardener's fault. Okay, so we're going to stop there.
Before we do questions, would you like me to stop the recording?
Yes, please.
Okay.
And